So for this week on CyberSchool, we're going to start kind of a new series on the channel where we're going to talk about demystifying and understanding overhead paging. It can definitely be kind of a complicated thing, and it's definitely kind of a niche in just overhead paging and notification in general. So we decided to do a kind of a small series talking about some of the components and building up as we build through, say, just a standard analog paging system all the way up to, a fully fledged IP-based system. And today is going to be the first in this new series. So, of course, what is an overhead paging system? Before we really start talking and understanding about paging, we need to kind of understand what the phrase overhead paging system is. And an overhead paging system is just going to be a series of speakers that's used for an announcement, for announcements and background music. And the overhead paging system comes in because they're typically mounted in ceilings, so they're over your head. It's very literal style of naming. And there's going to be two styles of implementations that you can run into for this style of a paging system, an overhead paging system. And that's either going to be a completely analog based, which is honestly the vast majority of paging systems, but there's also an IP based paging system that we'll cover in some later segments in a few weeks. So what makes up an overhead paging system, and what kind of components are we talking about? Well, to start, it's going to, of course, be some kind of an analog amplifier. And then you're going to have copper wires that connect to the speakers. And those three pieces are going to be basically the base ingredients of every single overhead paging system. You've got your analog amplifier, wires, and speakers. And all the wires are doing is connecting that amplifier to the speakers. That's all they do. So really it's two pieces and one connector. But every kind of amplifier is going to have some different interfaces, because if you just have an amplifier that's plugged into speakers, it's not doing anything. So you need some kind of an interface to get different audio into that specific paging system. And of course, there's a multitude of different, connection options for an amplifier because they're typically meant for music. So you're going to have things like, say, very old school, like a tape deck or even an 8-track input, or sometimes with, an actual record player for vinyl. But for the purposes of today's discussion, we're talking about phone system, because we're talking about an overhead paging system, not an overhead music system. So a lot of the times these different amplifiers are going to have either, say, a dedicated phone, and this is kind of more old school style, where if you're trying to make an announcement, say in a warehouse area, you got to go over to the paging phone and you got to pick up the phone and make your announcement. Sometimes, and a lot more commonly, you'll just have a specific port that's used on that amplifier for a phone system. And a common example that we've all seen is when you go to the grocery store and they need more checkers because they've got one person checking out. There's like a line of 12 people because somebody's trying to ring up way too much stuff and they're being complicated because they got to scan all their freaking coupons. So, you're stuck there, you're waiting in line, and the person at the register picks up their phone, they press a couple buttons, and you can see them talking into their handset, but you can't hear them, and then they hang up and it starts playing overhead. More checkers needed, please come up to the front. So that's using an input port on that particular amplifier for the phone system. So that way you can get the audio through. But another example, and we've seen this a lot in movies where you've got, all of your worker drones down there assembling widgets on an assembly line, and you've got your big mean boss guy watching them up from a big, glass cube, and he's watching them all, and he presses the button on his microphone and he yells into his microphone to work faster or nobody gets their lunch break or what have you. So those are the three kind of style of interfaces that you can run into with a standard paging system. Of course, you've got the older style, again, just that dedicated phone, the more common implementation, which is just a way to tie in your existing phone system, or in some cases, a desktop microphone. A lot of the times there's kind of a mix of the three options there, but a lot of the times also on these different amplifiers, you're going to have a radio system that'll also provide background music, because a lot of the times people aren't making emergency notifications or general notifications through the paging system. So, in the example of a grocery store, they're usually playing some kind of, radio, and then different deals. And of course, at least they've stopped recently, but, warnings to social distance and wear your mask and all that good kind of stuff. So a lot of the times these systems are multifaceted and they do many different things in addition to just providing the overhead paging and notification capability. So what is an amplifier? We've talked a little bit about an amplifier. Well, that's going to be a device that takes electrical power, meaning you're going to plug it into, say, a regular wall outlet. Here in the States, it's going to take, that regular 110 AC voltage power that we get, and it uses that to amplify audio. And some common examples that you can think of when you're thinking of like, well, okay, what is an amplifier? We've all interacted with stuff like this, whether it's, something, let's say, like a home stereo, or if you've got one of those, fancy Vizio 3.1 Dolby Digital surround systems, and you've got that big bar that you plug in to, the wall, and you plug into your TV with an audio cable or something. That's an amplifier. It's just done a little bit differently, but a more common example that I'm sure everybody, even the Zoomers that are watching this, is a Bluetooth speaker. That's an amplifier. It's just all contained, and you don't actually plug it into a wall. It's just got a battery pack on it. And that's going to go and amplify an audio signal. And that's all an amplifier does. And a lot of times, like I've mentioned, these amplifiers are going to have a whole bunch of different inputs on it for different audio sources. Of course, music is one of the big ones that everybody uses these for. Again, telephone is another big one. Sometimes a dedicated microphone input, because those can get very complicated if you're dealing with, say, a condensing microphone and all the subtle nuances that go with microphone, audio science and all that good stuff. CD inputs, not as common anymore, and the list goes on. If you can think of some kind of an audio output device, some kind of an audio signal, there's probably an input for it on an amplifier. And these are, again, just going to connect to some kind of a speaker using copper wires. And a lot of the times, these different amplifiers are going to have different voltages and or different wattage options. So that way you can go and you've got to figure out, okay, what do all these voltages mean? What is wattage? So let's talk about that. So voltage is defined as the difference in electrical potential between 2 points, which in a static electric field is defined as the work needed per unit of charge to move the test charge between the 2 points. Basically, how much power is needed to move an electrical charge from point A to point B. And wattage is defined as the rate per unit of time which electrical energy is transferred by an electrical circuit. The scientific standard unit for power is the watt, which is 1 joule per second. And these are fancy technical terms, honestly, not at all important for what we're talking about, but I like to define these terms if we're going to be talking about them. So what do these have to do with amplifiers, and how do they actually apply to amplifiers? We're dealing with this fancy electrical engineering mumbo jumbo. What does this actually mean with an amplifier? Well, generally, a higher voltage on an amplifier is going to mean that you can have a longer wire run length, which means if you're trying to, say, outfit a giant warehouse, say, a 100,000 square foot warehouse with an analog stereo system, having a little 25 watt a 25 volt amplifier, you're not going to have as much of a run length as you would with, say, a 100 volt amplifier. So with that, some common voltages that you can run into with different amplifiers are going to be either 25, 70, or 100 volt. And a lot of these different amplifiers out there, especially modern ones that you can get today, are going to have a mix of these 3 different voltages. Typically here in the States, you're going to run into a 25 or a 70 volt amplifier, but sometimes in the EU and the greater part of the world, basically outside of the States, you'll run into a 100 volt system. And then when we're dealing with wattage, think of that as basically your power bandwidth that you have for that amplifier. And that's going to be the actual power itself that's used by the speakers. And you'll commonly refer to people say that, okay, this is a 2 watt speaker, a 3 watt, an 8 watt, what have you. And that's the actual power that the speaker itself consumes when it's producing the audio. So all of these different amplifiers are going to be rated in watts, which again just dictates the power bandwidth that's available for the amplifier. And this can really range depending on the needs and the use cases of that particular amplifier. For example, right here on my desk to test our different products with, I've got a little 15 watt amplifier that's perfect for what I need, since it's running one little horn and it's used to make very small announcements. But if you're trying to do, say, an entire school or a big factory or warehouse area, you're going to need something like a 250 watt, a 300, a 500, even a 1,000 watt in some cases. But the common ranges that you're going to run into are anywhere between 15 to 500 watt amplifiers. And again, that's just the power bandwidth and the power capabilities of that particular amplifier. So now that we kind of know a little bit about voltages and wattages, how do you pick one of these voltages? Like, how do I know what's best? Well, we know that higher voltage means a longer run length. So 100 volt has to be best, right? Like you would think, Okay, I want to be able to do this as far as I can, so that way I don't have to think about and worry about, wire run lengths. If I pick 100 watt or 100 volt, I'm good to go. Not necessarily. Depending on the actual use case and where the speaker system is going to go, that might actually be a really bad idea, because speaker voltages are a lot of the times dictated by the specific building codes for that area and how that building is going to be used. As an example, most schools and hospitals only allow up to a 25-volt system. And you say, why would they do that? Hospitals are usually big. Why would they have to have something small? Safety, of course. That's the big thing. When you're pushing more voltage through the copper can get hot. Hot things catch on fire, so on and so forth. So generally, when you're dealing with a lot of different public buildings, you're going to be limited to 25 volts. But sometimes for, say, more industrial or professional style settings, you can run into the 70-volt systems, where they might not have those building code limitations that other places will. And even in some cases, especially with 100-volt systems, higher voltages like 100 volts actually require the speaker wire to be run through electrical conduit, which means you're not only paying for all of that expensive copper, but then you got to pay for all of that conduit to actually route the power, route the actual cable through, just to have everything up to code. So picking a 100-volt system could, mean you could have very long run lengths, but then, you got to look at how much money you're going to be spending in wire, and then how much money you're going to be spending in conduit. So it might make more sense to, sacrifice that little bit of a run length and go for that 70-volt system. But again, everything is going to depend by your specific use case and your building codes, and everything is going to vary, especially here state to state, even county to county. So really do consult experts in your area for specific regulations. Check with any contractors that you might be working with as you're trying to design something like this, or call up the city and see what they have, if they have any recommendations or specific regulations for your particular use case, because every situation is going to be a little different. So when you're dealing, now that we've kind of covered the overhead paging system and kind of talked about it, we kind of have a pretty good understanding of it. How do you interface with these different overhead paging systems? You've got this new fancy VoIP system. You've got your fancy Ring Central. How the heck do you connect to this amplifier? Well, most amplifiers aren't going to integrate directly with VoIP phone systems. So a lot of the times you're going to need a third-party integration device. And there's a multitude of manufacturers out there that manufacture some kind of little box, kind of like our CyberData SIP paging adapter, part number 011233, that can interface with these different analog amplifiers and provide you that capability to actually connect to that amplifier. So that way you can still use that analog system and use it with your fancy new Ring Central, Zoom, Cisco, WebEx, what have you. You can use it with that new system that you have today. So when we're dealing with our SIP paging adapter, it's designed as a SIP2 analog out style device, meaning it receives that phone call, that SIP call, from whatever phone system you're using and converts that into analog audio. And because we know about analog audio now, we know that we can interface the paging adapter to one of these existing analog amplifiers using probably that telephone input. So we can go and provide that analog output to the amplifier itself. And we've got two different styles of connections that you can use to connect into that amplifier, either an RCA style, so that's super duper easy. Of course, in ours, it's a mono, so it's a one side, but, everybody from those old composite days from back before everybody had, LCD and LCD and LED TVs, when we used to have those old composite cables, the red, the blue, the green, the white, the yellow, when we had all of those, that's an RCA cable. So they're very easy to plug in. But we've also got more of a tip and ring style connection, which you can use on that little green screw down interface, which provides you more of that kind of older school style option if you want to use actual screw down terminals, or you have to use screw down terminals depending on the particular amplifier. And every amplifier is going to be different in terms of how do you connect to it. So that way, with these two different connection styles, your RCA connection or your tip and ring style connection, this one box, the SIP paging adapter, can connect to most amplifiers out there. So again, to kind of summarize, what is an overhead paging system? It's going to be a critical part of any business or public building because it's used to provide emergency notification, just in case something terrible is going on, or in the happy sense, they're having a blue light special because, somebody ordered too many chickens. So, if you buy one chicken, you get two for free or something, so they're a critical part of every business or public building because they can provide that additional notification capability. And it provides that paging to people that are going to be in that building, whether it's used, say, in a school, it's used by patrons, say, in a grocery store, or by kids attending a school. The most common implementation that you're going to encounter out there in the world today is going to be your analog-based system, meaning it's got that analog amplifier, copper wire, and speakers that we've been talking about. And so that's going to be your kind of typical system that you're going to run into. In our next segment, that we're going to talk a little bit more about zoned paging and what it means to actually have multiple zones in a specific paging system, and how we kind of build on just a standard amplifier with our understanding. We can build to understand what a zoned paging system is.
Thank you for watching this edition of CyberSchool. If you have any questions, please get in contact with our sales department. They are available by email at sales@cyberdata.net or by phone at 831-373-2601 extension 334. Please make sure to like this video and subscribe for more content like this from CyberData.